Hello everyone, 大家好. Welcome to the Future China Hands program. My name is Xiaoyu. I'm a policy professor at the University of Nevada. I'm also a public intellectuals program fellow with the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations. Through the Future China Hands program, we invite the leading China experts from different sectors to share their experience. We hope our program could inspire young students, from high schoolers to PhD students. We also hope we can provide a platform so that educators, leading experts could brainstorm the past and future of China studies. I hope you will enjoy the program. Thank you. Professor Gold is a sociology professor at UC Berkeley. He's a leading China East Asian expert. He published widely on both society of the Taiwan Strait, so Taiwan and the mainland China. And also he has served as advisor, board members for so many organizations dealing with East Asia or China affairs. He has been a mentor for so many young students, emerging junior scholars in different parts of the world. So we're really honored to have Professor Gold to be the speaker. So today's format is rather like informal. As the moderator, I will post some questions to Professor Gold. And while he addresses these questions, he might share his ideas, suggestions. In the end, we have some Q&A. So that's the agenda. So Professor Gold, or I can call you Tom, really great to have you to join the conversation, our conversation.
Well, thanks, Xiaoyu. It's really an honor to be invited to meet with you and your fellow scholars and students and community members.
So before I ask you questions about your own learning research experience, I want you to address a broad question. So assuming some of the students in the audience, they might be like high school students, undergrads, graduate students in the new semester, they consider whether they want to study Chinese language or politics, history, sociology related to China. What do you say to them? Why China studies is still important, could be interesting, exciting, so important given all the challenges ahead. So from your experience in the very beginning, how you tell the young students it's important to learn the language, learn courses related to China?
Well, you answered the question. China is just, first of all, it's just really, really interesting on its own. I'm going to give you a list of sort of practical reasons for learning more about China, but I think China is almost like a drug. It's just once you start scratching beneath the surface and learning things about China, starting with the language, I hope, but so many other things, I find you just want to learn more and more. And in my time at Berkeley, I had a number of students who just, for something different to do, they would take my course on contemporary Chinese society, and then they would come to my office hours, do independent projects, take other courses that I had taught, that I had offered on China, or other courses on the Berkeley campus, because we have big offerings of courses on China. So first of all, China is just really, really interesting. And the other, of course, there's a whole list of practical reasons that people want to study China. First of all, the population. You know, China's what, 20% of the world's population. So you can't really do much if you ignore the effect and the contributions of people in China. Then, of course, the Chinese economy is now the second largest economy in the world. And many people think before long it'll be the largest economy in the world. China's an integral part of so many global supply chains, that so many things. So the US, with the decline in US-China relations, has talked about decoupling, trying to separate the Chinese economy from the US economy and maybe other economies in the world. It's impossible. China is too deeply integrated into the global economy to just say, okay, for the Americans or anybody else to say, we're just going to decouple. China also, because of the size of its economy, just consumes so many raw materials, and it's a major source of a market for raw materials, which then it processes and converts into finished products or intermediate goods, which it can export around the world. And China itself has a great deal of rare earths and other kinds of raw materials. China's become a major player in foreign direct investment. So many Chinese companies listed on foreign stock exchanges, Chinese companies investing abroad here in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and so on. There's just so many Chinese companies that it's become a major player in our economy. Outbound tourism. I'm not sure about in Reno, but I think Las Vegas for sure. But also in the Bay Area, the number of Chinese tourists over the course of the last few decades, as China's economy has taken off, is just astounding. And so much of the tourist industry has become dependent on Chinese tourists. Study abroad. Berkeley, just from very small numbers, now has hundreds or thousands of students, international students coming from China. And because many of them are not on fellowships, they have to pay full fare, full tuition. So the universities have become very dependent on Chinese paying tuition. China's a gigantic market now for so many different things. China's a major investor in Hollywood. On the airplane the other night, I watched Godzilla versus King Kong. Don't tell anybody. But I think that there's a major Chinese investment in a lot of these big budget action films and so on. China's role in just science and technology, in AI. And then I could give you, I don't know how much more you want me to talk about, but public health with the pandemic, virology, geography, the effect of China on climate change and the environment, China's thirst for raw materials. Of course, its military modernization has a lot of people quite concerned. Many people see China as a threat to its neighboring countries, both militarily and environmentally. China's huge appetite, say, for seafood and for fish. The Chinese fishing fleets are sucking up so much of the fishing stock, and also Chinese oil exploration for undersea oil. Many people feel that China is becoming a bully, not only in its own region, but around the world. And its role in international organizations has become increasingly important in areas such as human rights, for instance. And the Chinese are getting a lot of organizations to vote on their side on issues like genocide or on human rights or on rule of law of the sea, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure if you could think of some other things, but just off the top of my head, those are some important reasons. China's very interesting on its own, but in almost any profession that people want to go into, you have to take China into consideration. And the more you know about it, the more informed decisions you can make.
Wonderful. So very interesting that you put the pragmatic reason second. You put the interesting part first. I think that's very interesting. In a sense, maybe many people understand China is so important geopolitically, diplomatically, economically. But you said that China itself is so interesting. So the society, people, history, culture, it's so rich. So in a sense that in terms of like a diversity, I mean, the Chinese society, and even contradiction. So some people say that we can say anything about China without getting it right, but you can say anything about China without getting it wrong. So there's so many interesting dimensions about China, either history, politics, and society. So I want to revisit that in a moment. So later, when you talk about your research, your study research in early years, your teaching publications, I want to revisit some aspect of your observation about the Chinese society, compare mainland China with Taiwan. But I want to get back to a very original question: is that for many young students now, they might when they decided, oh, okay, I want to be a China expert down the road, whether language training is necessary or not. Now, sometimes this even become a debate. Some people say, oh, given we cannot travel to China in a short time, maybe people just could become China hands without learning the language. But I guess you might disagree. Maybe many people disagree. So in terms of language learning, what's your experience in the early years? How did you learn the language? Any sort of challenges at that time? And later you served as an executive director of a top language program, Chinese language program. Can you also maybe briefly talk about that program as well? For some maybe students in the audience, they might not know that program. So the second question I want to ask is about your own learning experience, teaching experience, about the language training.
Well, I have you can look at me and you can see I'm not Chinese. And I have no family connections to China. For instance, many older people who became China experts were the children of missionaries in China, foreign Christian missionaries. They were born in China. Many of them learned Chinese as their first or growing up. I had none of that. I went to Oberlin College, which is a liberal arts 4-year college in Northern Ohio, not far from Cleveland. And Oberlin had actually a long history with China. It was a missionary. Many missionaries from Oberlin went to China. And my freshman year in college, I didn't know what I wanted to do, what I wanted to major in, but I took a course in Asian history. I thought it looked interesting. And my professor had lived in China in the 1930s and the 1940s. And here we're talking about the 1960s. I went to college in the 1960s. I'm very old. And I took his course, and he told stories about living in China, which I'm from Ohio also, and I had never been abroad. And his stories were so captivating about living in China and meeting famous Chinese people, and also not famous Chinese people. I got really interested. It just seemed so exotic. And Oberlin, it was very unique that in the 1960s, Chinese was not offered as a foreign language in most schools in the United States, mostly only in big research universities like Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Berkeley or Stanford. But a small liberal arts college like Oberlin, it was very rare. And a group of us who took this history course, we all found it really interesting, and we dared each other to take Chinese. I'll take Chinese if you'll take Chinese. Because at that time, it seemed totally crazy. It was completely impractical to learn Chinese. Plus, unless you wanted to be a diplomat or a professor of some dealing with China, but you couldn't go to China. China was closed to Americans. There was no business with China. Why would anyone waste time studying Chinese? But I got completely hooked from the first day. I just loved studying Chinese language. I could not get enough of it. So my answer to your first question is anybody who wants to call themselves a China expert absolutely has to invest time in studying Chinese language. You cannot really call yourself an expert. Yeah, there's so many Chinese who speak English. There's so many materials are now produced in English or in other foreign languages. But to really get an in-depth feel for the country, you have to be able to operate in the language. So right now we can't go to China except very unique circumstances, but we will be able to go again. And it's just critical to be able, not only for research purposes, but just for getting around. And I found, being a foreigner, being a non-Chinese, when I've gone into hotels or restaurants or office buildings or whatever and speak Chinese, you could just see the people's faces relax and how happy they are. Say, "Oh, 你中文讲得很好." Even no matter how bad my Chinese might be, they always are so thrilled, relaxed, and people just open up when you can speak the language. So just for yourself, your ego or your self-confidence, being able to speak the language is so critical. So when I started studying Chinese, there was never any thought that I would be able to go to mainland China. The only place you could study Mandarin Chinese as a living language was in Taiwan. In Hong Kong, you could go to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong, they speak Cantonese. You could go to Singapore, but in Singapore, most people didn't speak Mandarin Chinese, they spoke Hokkien, which is actually the most common dialect or language that people speak in Taiwan. So the only place to really learn Chinese from the inside and on a daily basis was to go to Taiwan. So I spent a summer in Taiwan, and then after I graduated from college, I taught English in Taiwan for 2 years, and I studied Chinese on the side. So you mentioned IUP, which is the Inter-University Program for Chinese Language Studies. This was the elite Chinese language program, initially based at Taida, National Taiwan University. And the executive office was at Stanford, and the board was made up of representatives of basically all of the leading research universities in the United States. And I'm very sorry that I never studied there. I never actually took the time to study there, but for some crazy reason we don't have to go into, I became the executive director because the office moved from Stanford to Berkeley. And for 16 years, I was the executive director, and I would love to go to Beijing and sit in on classes and interact with the teachers. And it was so many now of the leading newer generation of China scholars, foreign China scholars, mostly from the US, but including Europe and other places, spent a year or a semester, a summer at IUP in Beijing. The teaching program moved from Taiwan to Beijing Tsinghua University, which is where it still is today. So currently it's operating, I'm not the director anymore, but currently it's operating virtually, which is not ideal. But Taiwan has many great language programs. So for people who want to live in the language and learn by doing, there are a lot of opportunities in Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan is also under quarantine, can't go there either. And they're offering programs online, I think. But in any event, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to work on your language.
So the lesson I got from your experience is that despite all the difficulties, like in the 1960s in Ohio College, you want to learn Chinese was difficult, but you really was fortunate to got an inspiring teacher.
Exactly. Inspiring teacher. Inspiring teacher, and I just loved. It's hard to describe. I had studied other foreign languages in school, but was just sort of I mean, I didn't do very. I didn't excel, and it didn't grab me. But there was something about Chinese. Maybe it was because it was exotic, and it just was so crazy.
So interesting. Okay.
So interesting because my first teacher was actually an American whose tones were not very standard, but he could write and he could translate poetry. So from day one, we started learning characters. Most of the time, you don't start learning characters right away. They work on your vocabulary, your tones, your grammar. But we started learning characters right away. And it was just, I don't know what you were like as a little child learning characters. It was a drudge. But for us, it was a fantasy, couldn't believe I'm learning how to write Chinese.
Okay, wonderful. Now, let me shift to the discussion about your research. Starting from Harvard, you were a PhD student there. Then your dissertation about Taiwan, right? So eventually became your first book. Then you also studied some other topic related to Chinese society, Taiwan society, especially about like a topic about guanxi, social relations. So can you talk about like how you pick up your dissertation topic? Like how your advisor, Professor Israel Vogel, is the giant figure in the East Asian field. What his advice to you? You think good idea? You want to, like, some of the participants in the audience are either PhD students or PhD advisors. So I mean, it's very useful to think about in retrospect how you pick up your dissertation topic, what kind of any dynama or any choices Professor Vogel told you, or talk about your dissertation, talk about your book, talk about your research broadly. So
Okay. So Vogel was also from Ohio.
oh yeah,
So I
Ohio
think
boy.
we had, in Chinese, you say yuan fan.
Oh
I mean,
yeah,
we had some sort of fate brought us together.
uh-huh.
And when I went to Harvard, I started in a master's program in East Asian studies. And my plan was to go on for a PhD in history. But Vogel had been told by somebody from Oberlin to look me up. And he took me under his wing from the beginning. And he said, he introduced me to a group of graduate students he was working with in sociology who were working on China, Japan, and China and Japan primarily. And he formed us into a group. And then he said to me, would you like to go into sociology for a PhD program? And I said, I've never taken a sociology course. I don't know anything about sociology. He said, don't worry, you'll learn it. You're more, I said, I want to go into history. He said, no, you're more cut out to be a sociologist. So I don't know what that meant, but I said, okay. You know, he was a Wei Ren, as you said, you know, a great figure. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. Then I also, while I was at Harvard, through his introduction, his guanxi, I started interpreting for Chinese delegations coming to the United States. So on your flyer, you had the picture of me interpreting for Henry Kissinger. And Chinese to this day introduced me. They say, oh, he was Kissinger's interpreter. I said, for 2 seconds, I was Kissinger's interpreter. I wasn't really his interpreter, but in any event, I started interpreting for Chinese delegations. And that was what I wanted to do my dissertation research on, something about China. And in 1975, I actually made my first trip to mainland China with a group called the US-China People's Friendship Association. You couldn't just get a tourist visa. So that was my first trip to mainland China. And I got really excited and I wanted to do a dissertation on China. But right after that, US-China relations went downhill. I don't want to go into the details, but relations were bad. And Vogel said to me, you know, relations are bad right now. It's not a good time to get to start working on a China topic. You've lived in Taiwan. You're interested in theories of development, dependency, world systems theory, some of these things in sociology. Nobody writes about Taiwan. Nobody writes about Asia. They only write about Latin America and Africa. Why don't you do a project on Taiwan testing some of these theories? So I said, well, that sounds interesting. And he said, also, you lived in Taiwan for 2 years. You know lots of people there. You can use that guanxi. You can use those connections in order to collect data and do your research. So I said, okay, I'll do that. So I went to Taiwan 1977, 1978 to do my field work. And he was right. And the time in Taiwan, it was part of its rapid economic takeoff. People were really excited to be interviewed by somebody from Harvard and to talk about their experience. So I got deeply involved in studying Taiwan. I had lived there, but I'd never studied it. This time I actually collected data and did the research. Then I went back to Harvard to write my dissertation. And the summer of 1978, I interpreted for 2 more delegations and went back to Harvard to be a teaching assistant and to write my dissertation. But that summer, the US and China signed an educational exchange. So I said, gosh, it's a shame. I'm too old. I'm already a PhD student. I can't take advantage of the opportunity to go to China. And Vogel said, no, they actually want people who are more mature, who are older, who've lived in Asia to do this program. So I applied and I was selected. So in 1970, it ended up, I was selected at Thanksgiving 1978, but didn't go to China till February of 1979. And I spent the year at Fudan University in Shanghai. So there were 7 people in this first group, 6 of whom stayed in Beijing, but I went to Shanghai. Why did I go to Shanghai? Well, my research on Taiwan was about economic development, and many of the first capitalists in Taiwan had actually been Shanghainese on the mainland who had gone to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang after they lost the Civil War. So I wanted to get a feel for what the environment that they had come out of was like. So I went to Fudan. Fudan, there was no sociology in China at that time. Since the 1950s, sociology, they said it's a bourgeois field. We don't allow sociology. So I was enrolled in the modern Chinese literature department at Fudan. It's 中文系现代文学专业, the modern literature specialty. So I studied modern literature, but I spent a lot of time not only with friends at Fudan, but also people I knew in Shanghai and elsewhere in China, partly through my connection with interpreting. I was able to see a lot of the people I had interpreted for in the US, also through my Oberlin connections, because many people had studied at a school that Oberlin had run in Shanxi province, Taiguxian. And also at that time, there were a lot of young people, and Professor Xu Bin, who is in the audience, has just published a wonderful book about these Zhiqing educated youth who had gone from Shanghai primarily, but other cities into the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. It just happened the time that I was in Shanghai, they were coming back to the city. And so I hung around a lot of places where these Zhiqing, these educated youth were. So even though I was officially studying Chinese literature, I confess, I was not spending a lot of time preparing my class. I had read most of that stuff already. So I could spend a lot of time with other people. So two of my early publications were based, I didn't have a research project. So two of my early publications were based on my experiences. I kept really good journals. So my first published article was about these Zhiqing, like Xu Bin has written, educated youth who'd come back to Shanghai who I hung out with. Then I also wrote an article published, I think, in 1985 on Guanxi, because one of the things that really struck me living in China is all anybody talked about was Guanxi. It was like a religion. I mean, if you don't have Guanxi, you can't get anything done. Here's what the rules are, but don't pay attention to the rules. It's all based on who you know. So I became really fascinated by Guanxi. So then when I went back to the US, I finished my dissertation. So since that time, I've been going back and forth across the strait. And it's really interesting that so much of what China has done since it opened up in 1979 is following the experience of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, in terms of the relation between the state and the market and the state and society. So I have felt very comfortable going back both places. And again, getting back to language. Language is just absolutely critical to be able to do field work and to do so much research, which is important. You're muted.
Your approach, you have the language skill, you have this guanxi, this collection of these Chinese people from different sectors. So when you were in the field, you discover some research questions. It's not like you have like an abstract theory
Right.
and try to test. You went through the other process. You discover some interesting stuff there on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. And also, so another project, I had studied private business in Taiwan, the emergence of the bourgeoisie, the Taiwan capitalist class. And then when I went to China, there were no private businesses in 1979. But I went back in 1982, leading a delegation of American academics, and suddenly I started seeing some very small micro enterprises, we might call it. Then in 1984, I went again, and I was really struck by suddenly there were all of these markets, xiaotanzi, there was little stalls of people selling things, making food, tailors, barbers, all these kinds of things. So I got really interested in who are these people in a society like PRC, which has attacked private business, the tales of capitalism for so long. Why would anybody become a private entrepreneur? Even though the policy had changed, why would they trust the government to not confiscate whatever money they made, or to just not really let them make money? So one project that I conducted, again, I didn't go in with this idea. It just moving around China, I said, that's interesting. I want to learn more about that. So I published a number of articles on what they call them gati hu, or individual, they translate it as individual households. These are some really micro enterprises. So nowadays we think of Alibaba, and we think of Baidu, and we think of Didi Chuxing, think of all of these gigantic Chinese companies, which are global players. My interest was not in the big, there were no big ones at that time. My interest was really micro. And here again, language was so critical, as I would go into a small restaurant or I would go to a barbershop and I would just talk to the gatihu, the entrepreneur, to try to understand, why did you do this? Why would you trust the Communist Party to let you make money? And the Communist Party, I think, didn't know what they were going to do. And they kept backing off as more and more people were entering private business, making money, developing, stimulating the economy, paying taxes, making life so much more pleasurable and for people. So now you have the emergence of people like Jack Ma, these gigantic world billionaires, right? So again, I mean, it's just a case of being open-minded. I mean, attentive to what's going on and trying to understand it. That's where my research.
Basically, be ready to discover something new.
And in Taiwan, my initial work was on private business and foreign investment. But Taiwan has, and when I was living in Taiwan, it was under martial law. It was a one-party state, martial law, very limited freedoms. But I still had a lot of friends and I had a wonderful time there. But going back to Taiwan over the years, beginning in 1977, actually, you started to see the emergence of social movements and as a dissent, as an opposition. So then every time I kept going back to Taiwan, there was more and more openness until in 1987, the president and head of the Kuomintang Party, Jiang Jingguo, said, we're going to end martial law. We don't need it anymore. Our society has developed. People aren't interested in overthrowing the government. The party has to trust the people. So I've done a lot of research on civil society and the emergence, the democratic transformation of Taiwan. I've been doing almost nothing on the economy. It's much more on the sort of political side and social change. So there's so many interesting stories on both sides of the strait.
Yeah, related to this, I want to ask is your role as a public intellectual. So your research is not about just like some abstract concept. Your research is deeply sort of involved in society in Taiwan, in mainland China. You have been actively sort of engaged in so many organizations in the United States about U.S.-China, U.S.-East Asia relations. So you personally have witnessed so many ups and downs in the bilateral relations, and also the rapid social change first in Taiwan and then in mainland China. So I wanted you to talk about how you think about your role as a public intellectuals, and also maybe related to the next question is, given today's political atmosphere, the challenges, how we deal with China, discuss about China. So what's some of your advice for maybe younger students, young junior scholars, emerging scholars, how they think about, I mean, of course, this is so difficult, at least in the short term, regarding travel and other issues. But I mean, I can imagine when you started this, that was the real Cold War, during the real Cold War in 1970s. And then 1998, US-China had a big impact, like a downturn because of Tiananmen, right? So all these, 1989, yeah. So how you think about your role as an intellectual, your role and some advice for younger scholars or students as we navigate the current environment about.
Well, as I said, even when I started studying China over 50 years ago, it was like a drug. I started with the language and then I started studying basically everything. And as bad as things might be right now, I've never been able to shake it. It's deeply part of who I am. And my work with the National Committee beginning in the 1970s was a really important introduction to working with people throughout society, many different sectors of society, from Henry Kissinger all the way down. to try to educate people about China. That is, this was before China was really, such a global player, as I mentioned before. But it was just such a gigantic country, so many different aspects. It was really critical to learn about it. So through the National Committee, through the Asia Society, through other sorts of organizations, many since I came to Berkeley, local nonprofits, I've done a lot of public speaking. I've done some media work. I teach, teaching at Berkeley, giving guest lectures. I just feel that it's part of my mission to try to help people have a more objective, deeper understanding of China, and for the next generation. So things are really bad right now in terms of U.S.-China relations, and the chance of doing field work looks kind of grim certainly for the medium term. But China's not going away. China's not going away. It's critical that we have people in business, in media, in the government, in the military, in education, who know this country from the inside, who know it deeply, and can educate our society, educate Americans about what China is and what China's like. We're constantly surprised. I'm not saying that even no matter how much research you're going to be able to predict accurately, but you have to have a wide source of data and of things to help you make informed decisions. And this is, I think, where the Public Intellectuals program is so critical, because it's taking people from the rising generations of not only academics, but people in consulting and in the military and in business and in the media, and helping them have a deeper understanding of China, so that they're just not, one-sided. China's terrible. China's a threat. But you have to understand, China may be a threat. There are a lot of bad things, but to try to get a deeper understanding of where these things are coming from, what are the trend lines, how things might change. And, there's been all this talk about, was engagement with China a mistake? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's critical that we are deeply engaged with China, and that China is deeply engaged with us, and that we have a deeper understanding of each other. And for Chinese students who are in the US, I say the grad students, I would encourage more and more Chinese grad students in the social sciences to become Americanists, to study America. It's, it's great that most, people like you or Xubin, you study China and you bring a special understanding and worldview to do that. But it would also be great to train a new generation of Americanists. There aren't enough of Chinese who know America deeply. So that I think that it's critical for both sides. And therefore, when things do settle down, and they will settle down, we're prepared to hit the ground running and to work together again to avoid a lot of the problems that we're facing now.
Yeah, exactly. So you talk about China is so important, and for American society, it's very important for American sort of society from different sectors to have some sort of a real group of China experts to provide objective analysis and opinions about the U.S. relationship with China. And also, China is not a monolithic. It's a dynamic society. It's also be ready to be surprised.
Absolutely.
And get back to the story. You were interpreter for Kissinger and the little Chinese boy, Jet Li, right? Yeah. At that point, he was a 10-year-old wushu, right, martial arts practitioner. So who knows? Decades later, he became such an international,
a big star. Yeah.
Yeah, big movie star. I mean, international. So be surprised while engaging China. So that's
right.
Yeah. So I think we still have some minute, maybe 15 minutes also. So great. I would invite the audience to raise questions or comments. Please also identify yourself. Anybody, you can either raise hand, use the raise hand function. Anybody want to
or chat?
Any questions, comments?
Hi, I might have a question for you.
Sure. Okay. Identify yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Kevin Gunluck. currently a computer science student at UNR, and I'm just sort of like interested in things about China. And so I guess like I have one question, which is if one isn't to like professionally like do work in China or like major in Chinese studies, how can like the regular person help, I suppose, increase or improve the relationship between the United States and China in a positive way?
Very good question. I think, you know, one thing is that China, even if you can't physically go to China now, there's so many ways to access China and to understand China. And a program like this is one way, but there's so many websites now. The National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, or the Asia Society, or the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or the Foreign Policy Research Institute. These are all free. They all have websites. They all have lots of programs where people have talked about their latest research, their latest experience. They're maybe predicting economic development, science issues, U.S.-China relations, and so on. You can spend hours every day jumping all around the world, watching programs, and they all have time for Q&A where you could ask questions that you're particularly interested in. So I think there's almost too much information now. So that's one way, and then you can carry back, you know, the information you learn to your own community.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, give it a try.
Could I ask you again, what were the websites that you listed?
Well, one of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Asia Society. Now, Asia Society is based in New York. They have a website, Asia Society. But in California, in the Bay Area, we have Asia Society Northern California. And there's also Asia Society Southern California. And they all have their own programs. The president of the Asia Society is Kevin Rudd, who's an Australian, former prime minister and former foreign minister of Australia, who also studied at Fudan University. We have the same alma mater. He's fluent in Chinese. And he also is a foreign minister. I watched him earlier today do a program on Afghanistan. Another organization is CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mm-hmm. Then the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI, which is based in Philadelphia. The Center for Foreign Relations, which is based in New York. They all have pretty much every day or several days a week, they've got that'll give you a taste. You can come back for more if that doesn't satisfy you.
I want to briefly add what Professor Gold said is that there are many high quality websites, journals, organizations discussing China related issues, but also there are a bunch of like misinformation. So I think the minimum, so if you is not planning to be a China expert, but be an informed citizen, you need to be careful about where and how you got information and make your own judgment. I think that's the sort of the first step. So
they also, I think it's important. The pandemic in many ways has been really good for not only China studies, but for so many things, because there are all these programs which used to be, you would have to go into you would go to an auditorium, you would go to a meeting hall, and then you would sit in the program. And if you weren't there, you wouldn't know what was going on. But now, as a result of the pandemic, all of these things are online now. So I'm able to attend programs. I've been very busy. Some days I have 3 and 4 seminars that I attend all over the world because I can. And they're being recorded. So I see you're recording this, so that'll be in some sort of an archive. And I think that's really great. So you can pick and choose. And if you attend one sort of program from an organization, you say, I don't like the way that organization runs their programs. Well, find another one. So that's how I'm spending my time. Good pandemic.
Anybody? Any others want to raise questions, comments?
So I have one more question, and sure. I apologize if this may have already been addressed earlier on in the presentation because I might have missed a lot. But are there any general websites that you recommend for I guess real factual information that isn't misinformation?
Well, so the organizations that I just mentioned,
The ones, okay, well, yeah, all right.
but also
Very
say
high quality.
at Harvard, the John King Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies runs a couple of programs a week on all aspects of China, and they're all online now. I mean, they're all on the web. So that's another. I would certainly recommend. Harvard gets very high quality people, their own people and people from the outside. So I would check that out as well. And they'll show you often what's coming up in the next week, in the next month, and you pick and choose what sounds interesting, what doesn't. If you're in computer science, that's an area with China's role in high tech and in AI and in all this kind of stuff. They're critical players there, but not that that's the only thing you'd be interested in, of course.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay. Anybody? Xubing, are you there?
So
yeah. You any?
Not to put him on the spot.
Yeah.
I have lots of questions. I have lots of questions, but I guess we should open the floor to the people who have other questions.
Okay.
If anybody.
Anybody?
Yes, I have a
Nick,
question.
Nick Shirk.
Yeah. So I'm a little biased. Yes.
Identify yourself, Mimi.
Oh, okay. My name's Nick Shirk, Nicholas Shirk, whatever works easiest for anybody. I'm a grad student at University of Nevada, Reno as well. And I just had a question about trying to learn Chinese, I guess, if you had any recommendations of how to pick back up studying Chinese. I did 1 year in Taiwan learning Chinese, but since then it's kind of died away. Do you have any recommendations of how to get back into learning Chinese? And then also, would you recommend continue learning traditional characters, or should I switch over to simplified characters?
Well, one way you can keep it up is through something like Duolingo. Duolingo?
Yeah, the phone app. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that I reviewed, I used them to review, but I disagreed with a lot of their translations. So I don't think I'm the only one, but they kept telling me I was wrong. And I said, no, I'm not wrong. So, but Duolingo is a way. There might be night classes. I don't know if there's online things, or you can, there are a lot of websites from Taiwan, from China. There are news broadcasts, which are always very, very fast. I have trouble following those. There's lots of soap operas. But a lot of those soap operas, they speak a kind of, if they're costume dramas, they speak a stilted, not natural conversational Chinese. In terms of traditional versus simplified characters, on the mainland now, increasingly they're using traditional characters, because when they started doing so much business with Taiwan, with Singapore, with Hong Kong, with overseas Chinese communities where people had learned traditional characters, more and more they will recognize them. But if you learn one, it's not that hard to recognize the other. So I learned traditional characters living in Taiwan, and I just picked up simplified characters quite quickly. But I think there's just so much on the web, and a lot of it is free, that would be a way, I think, for you to get into it.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Jade Chen.
Sorry, is that me?
Oh no, Jade Chen. Jacob, you are Jacob. There's a.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I was looking for the mute button. I'm not that familiar with the feature in Zoom. Jade is not my real name.
Okay.
I'm a Chinese national working as a professional in one of the international organizations in the US. But I listening in this session only for personal interest, so it has nothing to do with my work. I just want to make that clear. So my question is actually from my my experiences in the past, especially 1 or 2 years. So if you look at the social media, people's opinions about, U.S.-China relations, you see so, polarized, tendency. And it seems to me that, most people that are active on social media, they do not tend to care at all what the scholars think and what the academia is saying about the China-U.S. relations. So they tend to, make a circle of themselves. So I don't see any way out. So I would appreciate your insights into, how much impact you see that the academia work is still having on public opinion, U.S. public opinion about China and vice versa. Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question. And the debate about China in the public sphere right now is, as you said, so polarized. It's hard to it's hard to find middle ground, and you can risk being attacked for saying one thing either from one side or another. Academics. One of the purposes of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations Public Intellectuals program is to get academics like Professor Pu and like Professor Xu to learn how to speak to broader audiences. And also, part of the problem with electronic media, with visual media, is you have so little time. Somebody asks you a complicated question. As an academics, we always say, well, that's a really difficult question. I have to give you all this historical background before I can answer your question. And then you've lost the audience, you've lost the reporter. Say, well, I haven't got time for that. Just give me one sentence. And then you give them one sentence, which exactly as you said, it plays into all sorts of people's prejudices. And if I've been interviewed, say, by print media, and you could talk to somebody for an hour and a half, and if you get one sentence with your name on it, you've already made some sort of achievement, but they're going to pick and choose. So the media, it's very hard. So going back to sort of the questions that Kevin was raising, it's best if you have the patience to watch a seminar that lasts an hour or an hour and a half and where people probe more deeply. And academics have to learn to talk to broader audiences to say, there are no simple answers. I'm sorry, I just can't give you a one word or a one phrase answer because these things are too complicated and they're too important. I noticed that somebody in the chat asked, it was direct to me, and I don't know if I'm going to lose him.
Yeah, I will pass one question. Maybe this is directly related to sort of your question you are addressing. Is that the previous question about America's sort of atmosphere, political atmosphere deteriorating? That's problem for China discussion, China topic. But there's a graduate student who asked about how about some research topic related to China now, given China's tightening sort of political control, political atmosphere, some topics might become sensitive topics. So how you think about that? I can guess in the early 1970s or 1980s, some of your topics probably at that point were sensitive as well, or
well, the thing is,
how you navigate these kind of.
Well, when I went to China in 1979, as I said, I did not have a research topic. I was just studying literature. And I didn't plan to write about youth. I didn't plan to write about Guanxi. These are things that just, as you said before, just through daily life, I said, that's interesting. I want to learn more about that. Maybe that's one reason that Ezra Vogel said I should go into sociology and not history. Because I always ask why? And so that's, and I want to talk to people. So there are people said, but you're studying literature. Why are you asking me these questions? Why are you interested in that? I said, well, I just want to learn more. So just keep asking questions. So even though now, some feels like anthropology, going to China where you have to do field work, you have to live in a village or in a community, that's not going to be possible for a long time. But a lot of other topics, they may be sensitive, but you can do them from abroad, relying on the internet, relying on seminars, relying on published materials. And there are now so many Chinese in the United States, for better or worse, that they're a rich source of data. I had my first Chinese graduate student did research based on the effect of the Cultural Revolution on the family, based on interviewing Chinese graduate students in the married students village in Berkeley. He was married and he was just hanging out with, all the other Chinese students who were there, and he was asking them about their experience during the Cultural Revolution. So he was very clever in using that as a data source. So now there's, that time there were maybe 100 students, Chinese students at Berkeley. Now there's thousands, and in, Reno as well. So there are, you can ask a lot more sensitive questions when people are abroad. I think they're not as worried that they're being spied on, or that their rooms are being bugged, or that somebody's tailing them or monitoring them than there would be actually in China.
Good. Maybe Jacob, you raised hands earlier. Jacob.
Yeah, hi. So I was curious. I've been trying to get a handle on the Chinese political scene, and I feel like a lot of the podcasts and videos I watch, there so many references to people who I don't really know. So I was wondering if you had any recommendations for I don't know, good lists of current informer or politicians or well-known figures that would provide kind of like a fairly quick but informative synopsis of those individuals.
Oh boy. Well, you made me think of two other things that I should, going back to Kevin's question, is there's a Chinese American named Kaiser Kuo, who lived in China for many years and was the public relations guru for Baidu, which is sort of Chinese Google. And he runs something called SUP China, which is you have to subscribe to. But he also did SUP China, which is printed. But he also, with a guy, a South African named Jeremy Goldkorn, runs something called Sinica, which is a podcast, which is absolutely terrific. And he interviews not only academics, but also business people, journalists, scientists. I mean, he's on top of every single question. Kaiser is terrific. And this is one of the best sources of information. And the podcasts last, how long? They last usually more than an hour. I usually listen to them when I'm driving in the car, long distance. But in terms of politicians who know a lot about China, boy, I'm stuck on that. I don't really know. No name comes to mind right away. Xiaoyu, you have any names of politicians that you would?
I think I remember the Chicago. There's a think tank. What is the thing? They run some like a politician elites database or something like that. I think that might help you understand.
But there are a lot of there are politicians who pretend to be China experts.
He mentioned about American politicians pretend.
Yeah, I think that's who it.
Oh no, actually, it was the other way around. I was just looking for resources on how to kind of get up to speed on Chinese politics.
Somebody posted there, Marco Polo. There's some sort of think tank.
Yeah.
Oh, that's out of the I forget who's doing that. I can't remember.
That's Damien Ma and the Paulson Institute, right?
Is it Liu Demon or something? I forget who it is. In any event, Macro Polo.
Good. Any other? There's a final question, I think, from maybe a high schooler from
Damien Ma. Yeah, somebody just Damien Ma, I think, might be behind Macro.
Oh,
I think he might be based in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last questions maybe is from Wila Lu. She's maybe a high school student from our local community, Davidson Academy, one of the best high school, I think, in our community. And she basically asked about any ideas how to learn Chinese, especially memorizing Chinese characters. So challenge. Is there any good strategy, Professor Gold?
You just have to spend a lot of time, and you have to spend a lot of time memorizing. Now, you know, the technology has changed since when I started studying Chinese. There was no computer, you know. Now there's all these things you can practice on all sorts of handheld devices. But you just have to keep practicing over and over and over again. And if you get a chance to read simple things, not simplified, but simple things in Chinese, you'll start to recognize characters. And it's just a process of studying Chinese is all about memorization. And when I was young, my mind worked and I could memorize all of that stuff. But now I can't, you know, I've tried to learn Korean and I learned the Korean alphabet. But in terms of trying to memorize vocabulary and all that sort of stuff, just too old. So if you're in high school, go for it. That's a great time to start, you know, you have to spend a lot of time memorizing. The grammar in Chinese is not hard. The grammar is very easy. The main thing is the vocabulary and tones. You have to make sure you get your, you know, Mandarin Chinese it's a tonal language. So you can have a simple sound like ma. But if you say ma, 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 each one of those, we call them tones, has a different meaning. And sometimes, well, I don't want to go into it. It's too long. It's part of what makes Chinese fun, but it's also, you know, something that takes up a huge amount of time. But I saw someone had asked me, you know, they sent me a direct message asking for a layman starting to learn about China. And there's like a bunch of new books which just came out that I can't, but Evan Osnos, Osnos, has a book a few years ago called The Age of Ambition, which covers a lot of different aspects of China. He was a writer for The New Yorker. And who else has written, you know, I'm trying to think who has written a China book lately, sort of that covers, you know, so many different topics. But, you know, go to a bookstore and look on the China shelf.
In terms of the foreign policy, I recommended The China Challenge by Tom Christensen. So I think I published it maybe 5 years ago, but it's very good book, readable book in terms of like engaging the public about Chinese foreign policy. I think
there were just 4 or 5 new books that came out on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh yeah, those books are also good. So yeah. Okay, so time is running fast. So we already passed our original scheduled time. So thank you so much, Professor Gold, and thank you for all the audience.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it very much.
This proves Professor Gold is really an inspiring teacher.
Thank you.
Inspiring mentor. So, and thank you. Pay attention to in the future. We will have some other programs forthcoming in the coming weeks and months. So thank you, everybody.
Let me know who they are. I want to listen.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.